The morning sun struggled to break through the thick mist rolling over the fields, casting a pale glow over the land that had been in Jacob's family for generations. He stood at the edge of his property, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, surveying the vast stretch of farmland that had defined his entire existence. His hands, calloused from years of toil, clenched involuntarily as he exhaled a slow, tired breath. This land had once been a symbol of resilience, a testament to the sacrifices of those who came before him. His grandfather had built this farm from nothing, carving life from the earth with nothing but his bare hands and sheer determination. But now, that legacy was slipping away. The fields weren't yielding as they once had. The seasons had grown unpredictable, the droughts longer, the debts heavier. Every morning he woke up to the suffocating weight of reality. He was running out of time. Jacob had always been a man of unshakable resolve, someone who believed that hard work would always be enough. But for the first time in his life, he felt doubt creeping in. The bank had already sent warnings. Another bad season, and the farm would no longer be his to fight for. He had spent his childhood running through these fields, watching his father and grandfather till the soil, with the certainty that it would always be theirs. But now he could see the future unraveling before him, one where the land was auctioned off, where strangers would trample the same soil his ancestors had bled to cultivate. The thought was unbearable. He wiped a hand down his face, exhaustion pressing against the back of his skull like a vice. He had sacrificed too much to let it all be for nothing. A gust of wind carried the scent of earth and decay, rustling the overgrown weeds near the old barn. His gaze drifted to the structure, its wooden beams weathered and cracked with time. That barn had stood longer than he had been alive, a silent guardian of his family's history. But like everything else on this land, it was falling apart. Something inside him stirred, an unspoken impulse, a need to do something, anything, to keep moving. With heavy steps he made his way toward the barn, unaware that in just a few moments his entire life would change. Jacob pushed open the heavy wooden barn doors, their rusted hinges groaning under years of neglect. The scent of damp earth, aged wood, and forgotten memories filled the cavernous space as he stepped inside, his boots echoing against the uneven floorboards. Shafts of pale sunlight filtered through the cracks in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes that drifted in the still air like remnants of the past refusing to settle. The barn was as much a relic as the land itself, a monument to time, labor, and sacrifice. His grandfather had built it long before Jacob was born, hammering each nail with his own hands, storing not just tools and grain, but the silent history of a family that had fought to hold on to this land. Now, the once sturdy beams were warped, the scent of rot creeping in from the corners where moisture had seeped through over the years. Like everything else on this farm, it was slowly succumbing to time. Jacob wasn't sure why he had come here. Maybe it was the weight of his thoughts pressing too heavily on his chest, driving him to move, to do something, anything, to distract himself from the reality clawing at the edges of his resolve. Maybe it was instinct, a whisper in the back of his mind urging him toward something he couldn't yet name. He took slow steps toward the back of the barn, his fingers trailing absently over the rough wooden beams, feeling their cracks and imperfections as if tracing the lines of an old scar. His grandfather had spent his final years sitting in this barn, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts he had never shared. As a child, Jacob had always assumed it was just age catching up to him. But now, standing in the same space, he wasn't so sure. The floor groaned beneath his boots, a familiar sound except for one moment when it didn't. A single step produced something different, a hollow resonance beneath his feet, distinct from the dense creak of solid wood. He stopped, his heart skipping a beat as he slowly stepped back, listening carefully. There it was again, a sound out of place, as if something was buried just beneath the planks. A cold unease prickled at his skin. He crouched down, pressing his palm against the floorboards, knocking lightly with his knuckles. Solid, hollow. His pulse quickened. Reaching for an old crowbar hanging on the wall, he wedged it between the cracks in the wood, his breath coming in short bursts as he pried with all his strength. The old planks resisted at first, but then with a sharp crack they splintered apart, revealing a dark void beneath. Dust swirled up from the exposed space, and for a long moment, Jacob just stared. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached down, his hands brushing against something hard, cold, and metallic. He gripped its edges, feeling the rough rust that had eaten away at the surface over time. With a deep breath, he heaved it upward, dragging it into the dim light. An iron chest. Jacob sat back on his heels, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He had lived on this land his entire life, worked every inch of it, and never, not once, had he heard of anything being buried here. Who had hidden this? Why? His gaze fell to the rusted lock sealing the chest shut. A shiver ran down his spine. Things are meant to stay buried, but as he reached forward, gripping the lock with unsteady hands, he knew there was no turning back. Whatever was inside, it had been waiting for him. Jacob's hands trembled as he ran his fingers over the rusted iron surface of the chest. The metal was rough, corroded by time, but its presence alone was enough to send chills down his spine. The air in the barn felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken, something buried along with this forgotten relic. The lock was old but stubborn, its once polished brass now tarnished and nearly fused shut by rust. He grabbed a hammer from a nearby workbench, his grip tightening as he raised it above his head and brought it down with force. The impact echoed through the barn like a gunshot. Again and again. With a final splintering crack, the lock snapped, falling to the floor in a cloud of rust and dust. Jacob hesitated. There was something unnatural about this, something that made his stomach twist in ways he couldn't explain. This wasn't just an old box forgotten beneath the barn. It had been hidden, deliberately placed out of sight, sealed away as if meant to be lost forever. But it was too late to stop now. He reached for the lid, gripping its heavy edges, and slowly lifted it. The hinges groaned, the sound splitting through, the silence like an unspoken warning. Inside, stacked neatly despite the passage of time, were bundles of old banknotes, worn but unmistakably real. The sight stole his breath. This was more money than he had ever seen in his life. He stared at the stacks of cash, his mind spinning. Where had it come from? Who had put it here? His grandfather had lived a simple life, built everything with his own two hands. There was no reason for him to have this kind of fortune hidden away. And then, tucked among the bundles of money, he saw something that made his heart lurch. A letter. Its paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the name on the envelope was clear, written in an elegant, deliberate script, his grandfather's name. Jacob swallowed, his throat dry. His hands, steady moments ago, now trembled as he reached for the envelope, his pulse hammering as he unfolded the fragile paper, and as he read the first line, his blood turned to ice. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means you have found what I never had the courage to face. The barn seemed to shrink around him, the world pressing in, suffocating as his eyes darted across the words. This money is not mine. It never was. It belongs to someone I betrayed. Jacob's breath hitched. His grandfather, a man he had idolized, a man who had taught him about hard work and honesty, was admitting to something dark, something he had kept buried for a lifetime. His hands tightened around the paper as he continued to read, his stomach twisting with every word. The money was stolen, and worse, it had cost someone everything. Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears. The weight of the past had just come crashing down on him, and he knew this discovery would change everything. Jacob's breath came in short, shallow bursts as his eyes scanned the faded ink, each word sinking into his chest like a blade. His grandfather, the man he had idolized his entire life, had stolen this money. And not just stolen it. He had betrayed someone to get it. His hands trembled as he gripped the fragile paper, his knuckles turning white. His mind raced, struggling to reconcile the man he had known with the confession laid out before him. How was this possible? His grandfather had been a man of honor, a man who worked tirelessly, who had taught him about integrity, about earning every cent with his own hands. Had it all been a lie? He forced himself to keep reading. I told myself I had no choice, that I was saving the farm, that no one would miss the money. But I was wrong, and I paid for it in ways you will never understand. Jacob swallowed hard. His grandfather hadn't just taken money. He had taken a life's work, someone's future. And from the way the letter was written, it was clear. He had lived with that guilt every single day. The letter continued, each sentence heavier than the last. I tried to make peace with it, but the past doesn't stay buried. He came back. He wanted what was his. I should have returned it. I should have done the right thing. But by then, it was too late. Jacob's stomach twisted. His grandfather hadn't just taken the money. Someone had come looking for it, and then he saw it. The last paragraph, the words shaky, uneven, written by a man whose hands were likely trembling with regret. If you ever find this, I beg you, do what I could not. Find him. Give it back, or this weight will haunt you just as it has haunted me. Jacob stared at the letter, the finality of its words pressing down on him like the weight of the entire barn itself. His grandfather had spent his life running from this, and now the responsibility was his. He looked at the money. Stacks upon stacks of it, enough to erase every debt, to save the farm, to change his life forever. A single choice. He could keep it. No one would ever know. The past was long gone, the people involved likely dead. He could rebuild, fulfill his grandfather's dream, save everything that was slipping through his fingers. Or he could do what his grandfather never had the courage to do: find the rightful owner, give back what was stolen, make peace with the past. His throat tightened, his heart hammering in his chest. He had spent his whole life believing that this farm was his legacy. But maybe this choice was. Jacob sat motionless on the dusty barn floor, the weight of his grandfather's final words pressing down on him like a stone. His entire life, he had believed in the purity of his family's legacy, in the unwavering righteousness of the man who had built this farm from nothing. But now, with the truth laid bare in his trembling hands, he felt like a stranger in his own history. The money sat before him, stacks of faded banknotes that could change his life in an instant. Every debt, every sleepless night worrying about losing the farm, gone. The answer to all his problems was right in front of him. And yet, it had never felt further away. His grandfather had kept this hidden for decades, choosing to live with the guilt rather than face the consequences. How had he done it? How had he looked Jacob in the eye all those years, taught him about honesty, about the value of hard work, knowing he had built everything on a betrayal? Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears. He had two choices. The first was easy: close the chest. Take the money, pretend he never found the letter. No one was alive to claim it anymore. It wasn't his fault that the past had been buried here. Maybe this was fate. Maybe his grandfather had left this behind for him, in a twisted, unspoken way. But the second choice, the harder one, was the one that made his hands shake. Find the man who had been wronged. Give back what was stolen. Right a decades-old injustice. His throat tightened. Would it even matter now? Would the man, if he was even alive, care? Would his family? But deep in his gut, he already knew the answer. Jacob exhaled sharply, gripping the letter like an anchor. He couldn't take this money. Not like this. This farm was his inheritance. But this decision, this was his true legacy. With slow, deliberate movements, he gathered the money, folded the letter carefully, and walked out of the barn. The sky above stretched wide and endless, the same as it had been for generations. But for the first time, Jacob saw it differently. This land wasn't just built on sweat and sacrifice. It was built on a secret. And today that secret would finally be put to rest.